Glory, thankful for the grace of Jesus. I'm thankful that when we are exhausted, when we're weary, when we've gone past the point of what we can do, He's gracious to us, and that's where faith begins. That's where He picks up and takes over for us. If you'll open your Bible to Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah tonight, I want to start off by just saying I am thankful for the opportunity to preach. I never take it for granted when I get to open up God's perfect word and get to do what God calls the foolishness of preaching. And so the Lord has given me a deep conviction around what I'm preaching about tonight, so my prayer is just that it's a blessing to each and everybody that's here. So in Nehemiah chapter 2 is where we'll be. As we approach the book of Nehemiah, my mind always goes to one place. Nehemiah is the man. As we start the book, chapter 1, verse 11, we're not going to read through chapter 1, but it says he was the king's cupbearer. I don't want to skip over that. Being a cupbearer was a high position. The king trusted him with his life. No joke, Nehemiah's job was to keep the king from being killed or being poisoned. And so as we read through Nehemiah, when we look into his life, we are looking at the life of a high-ranking official in the kingdom of Persia, which was a powerhouse in its day. We're getting a glimpse into what we could maybe consider or equate to our president's cabinet. We're getting a glimpse into their mind, into their thought, into their life. I was reflecting on how likable, noble, and smart Nehemiah must have been to even got to this position. The king didn't want just anybody around him. The king wasn't just looking for the next best fit, whoever would do. The king picked the best of the best to be his cupbearer. It was someone that he would have to engage with every single day, multiple times a day. And so to that I say Nehemiah is the man. But that's not the only reason why. Chapter 1 gives us a clear glimpse into his spiritual life as well. And once again, we see that he's strong and that he has a very, very strong spiritual life. Clearly had a very tender heart towards God and what God wanted from him. And God did us the favor, luckily, to use Nehemiah as a pen in his hand to record it for us, the life of Nehemiah, the building of the wall. And we get so much wisdom and insight through this book, and I'm excited to dive into it tonight. So if you'll look at Nehemiah chapter 2, in verse 17 is where we'll start. It says, "Then I said unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, also the king's word that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us, and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I them, and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem." If you're familiar with this book, then you are probably familiar with the fact that the wall was fully built by chapter 6. So we've got 6 full chapters to cover tonight, so we better get reading. No, I'm just kidding. But I do want to give you the highlight reel of those first 6 chapters. Just going through it, starting in chapter 1, I just want to point out in verse 3 through 4, you can follow along as I go through. I'll just shout the verses out. But Nehemiah was a man who was convicted about the work of God, and he earnestly prayed. And then later in the chapter, as it goes on, we can see that when he prayed, he was a man who claimed God's promises as he prayed. When you pray, do you claim God's promises as you pray? Do you claim that you're expecting for him to work in your life? That's something that Nehemiah did. In chapter 2, verse 1, his conviction for God's work ran so deep that an otherwise very stoic man who the king had never seen upset was visibly upset. And like I said, we're just running through the highlight reel so I can give you the rest of the message here. But chapter 2, verse 12 through 16, God gave Nehemiah the mission that we read about here. And Nehemiah made sure that he fully understood it before he brought anyone else into it. Verses 17 and 18, by the time Nehemiah shared where God was leading him, he was so convicted about what God was planning to do and the work that was at hand that others joined in readily. Skipping to chapter 4, through 1 through 9, every time we see opposition throughout the work of Nehemiah on the wall, Nehemiah decides to respond prayerfully and continues to leave God's plan in God's hands. He responded prayerfully in every conflict, even in verses 13 and 14 when there was physical harm and they had to work with a weapon in one hand and a tool in the other. Nehemiah still consistently provided prayerful, steadfast leadership. Reminded me of the verse in Proverbs 21:31, the horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. They had prepared for the work, and so it was up to the Lord to see the work through. They left it in God's hand. I'll skip up to chapter 6 in verse 9, and I'm running through this really quickly because otherwise I was going to go about 10 minutes over. As we went on, as time went on, in chapter 6, the work is almost done. Opposition continued, and Nehemiah prayed for the Lord to strengthen his hands so that he could continue the work and finish the work. So when things were getting weary and tired and things were drawing to a close, even what he couldn't do, what Lori prayed about, when he couldn't finish the work, when he ran through his stores of endurance, God was gracious to him and strengthened his hands for the work. Verse 6 or 15, we see that the wall was built in 52 days. God needed their all for a season. And in verse 16, the wall glorified God and was a testimony to the work and sacrifice of the families that put the wall up. And so in light of Nehemiah, that's the full highlight reel, okay? We got through that really quickly, which is good. In light of Nehemiah being used greatly of God, I just wanted to take a look at his life tonight and just preach about how we can also be greatly used of God. If I had to title the message tonight, I would call it Nehemiah from royalty to rubble. From royalty to rubble. In Nehemiah chapter, I guess I didn't have a verse reference right away, so I'll skip that. Nehemiah, number 1, was ready for the call of God in his life. In chapter 1, we can look at the book, and it's very easy to overlook a big factor of why God used Nehemiah. And that's simply that he was ready to be used of God. He had prepared in every way for this calling that was at hand. In his mind, in his body, and in his soul. I would be willing to bet that Nehemiah, given how greatly God used him, I would be willing to bet that he was very naturally gifted. I'd be willing to bet that he was very naturally gifted mentally and even physically. But how does being a cupbearer, though that's a high-ranking, prestigious position, how does that prepare you to build a wall? How does being a cupbearer prepare you to lead what was most likely thousands of people that helped him? There was a significant preparation that was involved for Nehemiah. Through the rest of his life, leading up to that moment, all leading to this opportunity that was at hand, Nehemiah had prepared. How does being a cupbearer correlate with ordering materials from all over the kingdom of Persia and knowing how to coordinate those deliveries, knowing how to use the materials once they got there? Nehemiah had clearly prepared his mind. And even if it wasn't for this exact task, he had clearly built skills that were transferable across multiple domains. And I just want to ask you, are you someone who is actively preparing your mind? Are you a learner? Do you ever pick up a book or tune into a podcast? Are you someone who's consistently looking to add some capital up here? And teenagers, you're still in school, or anybody that's still in college, are you someone who takes that school, that college, that learning opportunity seriously? I took a lot of chemistry classes in high school. I really liked it. I was really passionate about it. Took it 3 years in a row. That's how much I loved it. Me and Josh were lab partners for a couple months before Anyway, I liked chemistry. I even know a chemist that goes here. His name is Jerry. But I haven't used a single bit of that chemistry that I learned for 3 years straight since high school was out. So I get it. I get it if you're still in school and you say, I'm never going to use any of this in my real life. I understand. What's high school actually for? What's college actually for? By and large, learning how to learn. So if you're still in school, take it seriously. Learn how to learn how to study. If you don't, you will be light years behind those who did, and you'll have to spend time trying to catch up later. Are you someone who prepares your mind to be used of God? Are you someone who's consistently learning new skills, new ways to problem solve? Are you consistently learning from others that have gone before you and done it better than you? But not only did Nehemiah prepare his mind, he also prepared his body for the work that God was calling him to. I don't have a lot of wiggle room to talk about physical capabilities. I know 80-year-olds in this room, I'm looking at Brother Jim Adams, who have better knees than I do. I've already scheduled both my knee replacements for when I turn 50. But this is the body that God gave me. Am I taking care of it? God gave you one body. Are you taking care of it? Are you building it? Are you strengthening it? It says they strengthened their hands for the work. They prepared for it physically. One thing I was impressed by in chapter 3, verse 1, I was impressed by the fact that Eliashib and the men of God, the priests, they were physically prepared to do the work. They were physically capable with their hands. The priests. Anybody else, when you think of a priest, do you think of just kind of a frail old man? That's kind of what I think of. Aside from this one priest, I got his name in here, Kevin Fast. He's got 19 powerlifting records, and he's a priest. Other than him, I think of frail old men. That wasn't the case with Eliashib. Eliashib was physically capable. Let's just read chapter 3, verse 1. Then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brethren, the priests, so not just him, those who followed him, the other priests, and they builded the sheep gate, they sanctified it, and set up the doors of it, even unto the tower of Mia, they sanctified it, unto the tower of Hananiel. He was prepared. He had strengthened his hands for the work. He was physically capable with his hands. He knew how to swing a hammer. Eliashib had his shortcomings. You can read them in chapter 13. But even the high priest was capable. Nehemiah was physically capable, who was a cupbearer. Thousands of Jews who joined in on this work were physically capable. And so I'm asking, are you physically prepared to do the calling that God is calling you to? And I'm not just talking about how Brother Greg can leg press like 1,000 pounds at 60 years old and he's trying to be the best bodybuilder, that age bracket. I'm asking, can you swing a hammer? Can you turn a wrench? Can you dig a hole? If you're a lady, can you cook and prepare a meal for a family who needs your support? Do you know how to take care of babies and kids and support the families around you? Do you have an eye for decorating? Can you help out? We are never above, regardless of what it is, regardless of if it's swinging a hammer or digging a hole, the lowest of lows or the highest of highs, you are never above using your own two hands to physically work for the Lord. Are you prepared to use them? Have you strengthened your hand for the work? Nehemiah was mentally prepared, he was physically prepared, but we wouldn't know a single thing about Nehemiah, about his mental or physical preparation, if it weren't for his spiritual preparation. Nehemiah was ready at a moment's notice to go to God in prayer and plead for the people of God and the work that God was doing through Ezra in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was in a place spiritually where he could be deeply convicted about the state of Jerusalem. He shared the burden of God and the heart of God for the wall being destroyed, for the people there being oppressed. He shared in that conviction and in that burden. Nehemiah walked with God in such a way that when it was time for God to call him, God was very easily able to get a hold of him. God is sovereign. Psalm 115 says he hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. And God can and will at sometimes intervene to get a hold of you. I personally do not want to be in a position or put God in a position where he has to get a hold of me, where he has to shake me, shake some sense into me, shake my life up, turn me around. I don't want to be in that spot with God where he has to come intervene in my life drastically to get a hold of me. But he will, and he can. But if you're not prepared and willing, God will not call you to his work. There are people here tonight, and God wants to call you to his work. He wants to use you greatly, and you're just not ready. But why are you not ready? What is keeping you from being ready to answer God's call? Is it sin that you're stuck in? Is it being unwilling to change your thoughts, your mind, your heart towards something? Are you too comfortable to prepare yourself for the work that God's calling you to? Nehemiah was greatly used of God, first and foremost, because he was ready to answer God's call as soon as God called him. And number two, God called Nehemiah from comfort. God called Nehemiah from comfort. Nehemiah had a pretty prestigious job. I'm sure that he was living pretty comfortably as the king's cupbearer. He was close to the king. You would have seen him multiple times a day. He probably lived in the palace. He probably wasn't hurting for money. Probably wasn't in need or in want at any time. He went from royalty to the rubble of the walls of Jerusalem. He went from a gold cup in his hand, handing it to the king, to a splintering hammer. He went from leading himself, and that's all he had to worry about, to leading thousands of people. There was nothing about Nehemiah's life that would not have gotten significantly more difficult by what God was calling him to do. There was nothing in this life, here and now, that was in it for Nehemiah. This wasn't for his gain. It wasn't to increase in riches. It wasn't so that he could become the next king in Jerusalem. It was a difficult calling, and Nehemiah paid a great price. As we read in Nehemiah chapter 1, it would be easy to look at Nehemiah and his prayer life and immediately go, wow, he's so faithful. Look at his prayer life. He prayed to God in the palace. But in reality, Nehemiah's faith really came onto display in chapter 2 when he leaves the palace and he goes to Jerusalem to take inventory of the work that was needing done. As he left his comfort behind, his faithfulness was put on display. Faithfulness is a firm adherence to what God has asked of you, and that is not tested when what we want in life aligns with what God wants. What about when God asks for something and it differs from what we want? Do we comply? Do we adhere to what he's asking for us? Do we remain faithful? Or so often do we display a lack of faithfulness? Do we go with what we want, even though we know it's not what God wants? So your faithfulness isn't really displayed until it costs you something. It's hard to have faith in something when it's not tested. I could look at that chair behind me, and I could say, I know that if I sat in that chair, it's going to hold me up. I know it, without a shadow of a doubt. But until I put my backside in that chair, and it doesn't fall to the ground, it's just lip service. I can have all the faith in the world in it from here. But until I actually put myself in that chair and trust it to bear me, I'm just talking. When is the last time that your faith cost you something? As Lori's saying about, when was the last time that you went above and beyond where your reserves ended? When's the last time that you gave something up and trusted in God that his way was better than our way? When's the last time that you lived your life in such a way that actually allowed God to work in your life? When's the last time that we pushed past our own physical capabilities where only God could finish the work? In Nehemiah chapter 6, if you want to turn over there. In verse 9, for they all made us afraid, saying, their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it is not done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. The oppression that was on Nehemiah was saying, you guys have been working, you guys are weak, you guys have been doing this for months. Well, took 52 days. So a month and some change, okay? You're tired. Your hands are tired. You probably can't even hold up a sword. We're going to come get you. And Nehemiah went to the Lord and asked for him to strengthen their hands in a way that they couldn't do on their own. When's the last time that you worked until your hands are so tired that you need God to strengthen them? To finish the wall in 52 days, it was nothing short of a miracle. Nehemiah was gifted, sure, but not that gifted. It took him being willing to be uncomfortable, willing to push his limits physically, and willing to ultimately trust God that the God who gave him the work would help him get the work done. We know that growth requires effort, conceptually, at work, at school, in the gym with Brother Greg. Right now, I know you can't see it because I got these pants on, but my left leg is significantly smaller than my right leg. I've gotten slightly fatter since my injury, so I know it's not losing weight. I've lost 10 pounds. I think that's all quad muscle. It's sad. It's depressing. It's really sad. And I know that it's going to take another 9 weeks of physical therapy, pushing myself multiple times a week to even really be able to flex my muscle, let alone see it. And if it's anything like my other one that I did 8 years ago, I know it's going to take about 8 years for it to get back to the same size, and then hopefully I don't tear the other one at that point. Eventually they'll even out. I know when it comes to my physical therapy that growth requires effort. I know when it comes to my physical therapy that I got to put the work in. Why so often in our walk with God do we assume that it will always be so comfortable and so easy? Tonight is a great night to make a mindset shift across all areas of life. In any area that you want to do well in, it's going to take conscious, intentional effort. I hope that you want to do well in your walk with God. I hope that you want to hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And if that's your heart's desire, I hope you're willing to put in the effort that it takes to grow in your relationship with God. I don't want to just let life pass me by. I don't want to live each day in my own strength. I want to be used of God. I want to work to build His church. I want to work to build His kingdom. I want to work to win souls. Where does any of that have anything to do with being comfortable? I couldn't find a single person in the book of Acts that I looked at their life, they were serving God, and it looked comfortable. We are too comfortable. We have it too easy. In our American culture, where it doesn't take a lot of sacrifice to be here, we've traded our influence on other people and the world around us, the positive influence we could have, we've traded it for a laid-back life. We've traded our influence so that we could come here, go home, live our life in our own circle, not reaching the world around us. We're so caught up in this idea of work-life balance that we've forgotten what Christ left us here to do. I don't want to be balanced. I want to be used. We've forgotten that only what is done for Christ and for His eternal kingdom, the souls that you win, the work that you do for God, that's what will last eternity, and everything else at judgment will be burned up. God didn't call us to be comfortable. He called us to work for Him and to work for Him diligently. To work for Christ is the whole point. I don't need to balance my family and shy away from ministry. I need to involve my family in ministry. I need my son and my future children to see that it's Emily and I's mission to serve God. I don't need to separate them from that. I don't need to give them space from that. I need to involve them in it. I don't want church and ministry and serving Christ to be a part of our lives. I want it to permeate everything that we do. My prayer every night for Jude is that what we do for the work of Christ and the way that we conduct ourselves would permeate the rest of our life in such a way that by the time he is cognizant, it is only natural that he comes to Christ. It is the natural progression of what he sees his mom and his dad doing. I don't want to balance my life. I want him to be involved in the ministry that we are giving our life to. God didn't call Nehemiah to be comfortable. He didn't call him to be balanced. He called him away from that. He physically got him away from the comfort. He physically got him away from the balanced life, and he called him to work. I hope tonight that you're someone who is willing to work for God. Nehemiah was ready for the call. He was called away from his comfort, and he was called to God's work. God doesn't usually just call you away from something. He calls you to something that's in pursuit of him. He was called to the work of God. God sent Nehemiah on a very clear mission to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. And if we're going to be people who are ready to be called, if we're going to be people that are willing to step out of our comfort zone, that are willing to be pushed, then I want to take a moment to talk about how Nehemiah successfully executed the mission that God had set before him. It was no small task. Even after he got to Jerusalem, he was surrounded by opposition. The Bible talks about multiple ways that he was discouraged and actively opposed in the work that he was doing. He was opposed mentally, spiritually, and physically, and even when they were in harm's way. Chapter 4, like I said, talks about them having a sword in one hand or a weapon in one hand and a tool in the other. Even in the midst of opposition around every single corner, every single time Nehemiah was probably like, thank goodness they're gone, they were coming right back around. How did Nehemiah bring about success in the mission that God had put in front of him? The biggest thing that I noticed was that Nehemiah had a very clear vision. Nehemiah's vision, ultimately, we can go to chapter 2, verse 12. Nehemiah's vision, his mission, ultimately came from God. It says, and I arose in the night, in verse 12, and I arose in the night, and some few men with me. Neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. And there was no beast with me save the beast that I rode upon. Nehemiah had gotten a very clear mission from God. And then Nehemiah, as we read on, if you read through verse 13 through 16, he took time to assess the situation. He took time to take inventory of what needed to be done. He took time to establish a clear mission order, if you will. And whether it's in the work of God or in other areas of your life, do you take time to assess your situation and see clearly what you need to do to overcome that situation? This is applicable to everyone here, but especially for us men. Do you take the time to assess your task at hand, your mission, if you will, so that you can prepare and execute well? This is a crucial part of our leadership as men. Jesus himself said in Luke 14:28, as part of a parable, he said, for which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? A big part of the reason that Nehemiah saw success was that he had a very clear plan, and he took the time to put that plan together before he got anybody else involved. Another key part of Nehemiah taking inventory of the situation is that it built his conviction for the mission that God had called him to do. Let's reread chapter 2, verse 17 and 18. Then said I unto them, ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. So Nehemiah, number one, in verse 17, had taken inventory of the situation. He saw clearly what was needing to be done, and he communicated that to them. But in verse 18, it says, then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And this is key. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the work. Nehemiah had such conviction for the mission that God had put in front of him that when he explained that to the people that he was looking to have follow him and help him, they were 100% on board. They were able to share that same level of conviction. They shared the burden that him and God had shared. They said, let us arise and build. He didn't have to tell them to. They were proactive because they were so convicted. And it was this foundation that Nehemiah laid that set them up for success when opposition came. When opposition comes and no one sees what you're working towards, they'll bail. When opposition comes and no one else on your team is convicted about succeeding as you are, they'll bail. And whether it's in marriage, parenting, ministry, work, you name it, the principle is true that others' submission is greatly affected by your mission. As a husband, my wife is supposed to submit to my flawed leadership. If she cannot see, however, my self-leadership, if she cannot see that I'm intentionally leading us according to the mission that God has given us, the work that God has given us to do, it's going to be much harder for her to submit to me. It is hard for her to be sub or under my mission if I do not myself have a mission. This runs true with parenting, ministry, work, every other area. It becomes easier for others to follow you in true submission when they can clearly see that you are following the mission that God has called you to. I'm going to butcher it because, actually I don't have time, so I won't even give that illustration. I've got 2 minutes left. Ultimately, the submission is up to the person that's submitting. It's their responsibility with God. But so often, we lack any type of clarity, any type of vision, any type of proactivity, and we still expect others to follow us. What are you doing in light of Nehemiah succeeding in his mission by being proactive? What are you doing to be proactive? What are you doing to be proactive, knowing the work that God has called you to do? Are you someone who has vision? Are you someone who's working towards something? Are you thinking more than one step ahead? Nehemiah was proactive. He had a clear plan in place. He had conviction. And so when he faced opposition, whether it was words or literal, potential death, those who followed him, and himself included, saw his steadfast leadership and the mission that he was on, and they were so convicted about the success of the mission that they were willing to stay, even in the face of that opposition. Sometimes that work takes 52 days. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. Sometimes it's just VBS week, and you're going to be in, sixth gear for a whole week, and it's going to be really exhausting. Sometimes God asks you to run at 8,000 RPMs, but he doesn't expect us to do it all the time. But what God does expect from us all the time, whether it's at 8,000 RPMs or you're idling, is that you are always willing to kick it into gear when the mission calls for it. That you're always willing to make strides in your work for Christ. Are you working towards what God would be most pleased with you working towards? Or are you working on your own kingdom? Are you working on God's kingdom? Are you winning souls? Or are you winning people to yourself and building your own kingdom? Are you laying up treasures in your bank account here, in your 401k here? Or are you laying up treasures in heaven? God gives us a requirement that we have to provide for our family. If we don't, we're worse than an infidel. It's a blessing to provide an inheritance to your children, but if that inheritance comes at the expense of you doing all that God has called you to do, then we have failed. If I leave my kids money, but in my pursuit of that money, they didn't see me pursuing God, and that has no effect on their life, I have failed. I pray that my whole family would be on such a clear mission from God to serve him and to build his kingdom, and that all the inheritance that I'm leaving to my children are first and foremost spiritual. Are you living a life that is called and surrendered to God's mission? Nehemiah was greatly used of God. He was a great leader. This is because he was ready to be called. And I ask you tonight, are you even ready for God to call you? Have you taken any steps to prepare yourself mentally, spiritually, physically? Are you ready to be called, but you're unwilling to give up your sin or your comfort? I pray that you'd repent of that. God's calling for your life is so much greater than any pursuit that we could have here and now. Has God called you, but you're stuck trying to stay comfortable? You're stuck trying to stay balanced. Have you put a roadblock between what God is trying to do in you and through you because you don't want to move? Because you don't want to be moved away from your comfort? You don't want to give up the pleasures of this life? Are you counting the cost and not seeing the worth in pursuing God's mission? I'd encourage you tonight, you're never going to be able to count the cost of pursuing God because your treasures are not here. They are eternal. If God has called you to his work, are you being proactive? Do you have a vision? Do you have a goal? Are you working towards something? And can others see your conviction and your path to that goal? Christ is the conviction to follow Christ and build his kingdom at the front of your mind. If we lose sight of this, we will fail as soon as opposition comes. But if we have a clear plan, a clear vision, and people around us that share that vision and that plan, because we've communicated our plan and our conviction to them, we will see it through because God has called us to the work. Proverbs 29:18, and I'll close with this, says, where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. Let's decide tonight that we're going to get uncomfortable, that we're going to get called, and we're going to be willing to get our hands dirty for the work of Christ. That's really.